should the church engage with Black History Month, particularly if your setting is not very diverse? Do you worry that mentioning it might come across as token or inauthentic, or that you haven't got enough diversity in your leadership to do it justice? Perhaps you think this is a secular event, far too political or a woke agenda for a Sunday morning. Or maybe you think Black History Month should be an annual part of the church's calendar. Today I'm sitting down with Richard Reddie, Director of Justice and Inclusion for Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, to learn more about the contribution of Black people to our history in Britain, and particularly their massive contribution to the UK Church. For many years, the conversation about Black history have centred around Martin Luther King Jr. and the transatlantic slave trade, but Richard invites us to learn more. We discuss the impact of the killing of George Floyd, breaking the silence about racism, how we empower diverse leaders, and the impact of the Windrush generation on the UK Church. We know we have listeners tuning in from around the world, so in case you're curious about the timing of this podcast, in the UK and Ireland, Black History Month is observed in October. Canada, the US and Germany celebrate in February, and Australia's Black History Month is in July. Thanks for joining us on the Roots for Churches podcast. Here we go. Hello, welcome Richard to the Roots for Churches podcast.
Yep, hello, welcome.
I'm delighted to have you here. We're going to talk about Black History Month. And I want to start right off the bat with the question, should churches with few or no Black people in their congregations be marking Black History Month?
Yeah, I would say yes, categorically. I always say Black History Month is for everyone. If I had my way, it wouldn't be just a month, it would be marked throughout the year. And I think one of the things about Black History Month is that it's a celebration. So it's about celebrating the contributions that Black people or people of African heritage have made to the world. But I think in terms of our context, it's about the contributions that Black people have made to Britain. So I like to call it Black British history. And what's interesting is it's been around since 1987. And I think for the first at least decade and a half, it tended to focus on really American history. So it was generally about Martin Luther King. And if it wasn't about Martin Luther King and his humongous contributions, it then focused on the transatlantic slave trade, which was, I suppose, Africa, Britain, aspects of British history in that, but also aspects of Caribbean history. I think over the last 10 to 15 years, I think the focus really has been about the contributions that Black people have made to Britain over millennia. So it's not just really about the Windrush generation, 1948 onwards, but it's about, what Black people have contributed to these islands over a couple of millennia. So whether you're talking about in Roman times, or you're talking about Black Britons in Tudor times, or you're talking about Black Britons in Georgian times, and I mentioned slavery and its abolition, and you've in the 18th century you had Black Christian British abolitionists working alongside the more famous individuals like William Wilberforce and Thomas Clarkson and John Newton. But also you've got the contribution of individuals who sort of came here in the 19th century and also the 20th century. And then obviously the obvious thing is the Windrush generation. And I think the Windrush generation is important because for me, those individuals who came from the Caribbean on board that ship from 1948 onwards, up until what some would say 1972, many of them brought with them a Christian faith that has helped to revitalize the spiritual climate in this country. And I always say, were it not for the Windrush generation, particularly in certain denominations, would be in a perilous situation at the moment. And I think that's to be celebrated. We've got to thank God for the contributions that those individuals have made, in some respects, revitalizing the church in this country. And that's for everyone. And some have argued that the way we worship now and the way we do church has been influenced by the Windrush generation. So yes, that's for everyone, irrespective of whether your church is monocultural or homogeneous, in terms of its sort of ethnic makeup. It's important to recognize the contributions that the Windrush generation have made to the spiritual climate in this country.
Thank you. That's really helpful. So, Richard, before we keep going, tell us a bit about yourself. So, you have a role engaging in racial justice and speaking about this to the church. Where do you work and what do you do?
Yeah, so I'm currently the Director of Justice and Inclusion for Churches Together in Britain and Ireland, CTBI for short. I've been in that role since 2018. And my role really is to encourage churches to be more proactive on issues to do with justice, equality, inclusion, and diversity. I'm also the coordinator of the Churches Refugee Network. The chair is the Bishop of Liverpool, Bishop John Parambalaf. And I also work with Reverend Dr. Indigit Bogle as part of the Churches of Sanctuary. So my work really is justice related, and I always say justice is everyone's business, and I always say justice is unfinished business as well. So it's just to try and encourage churches to think of justice as something that they must engage with. I mean, there's so much in Scripture that talks about justice, and we always say our God is a God of love, but he's also a God of justice, and the whole theme of justice permeates Scripture, whether you're talking about the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, but particularly the New Testament. You look at the life of Jesus, and his life was justice in action. You look at something like Luke 4, verses 17 to 21. For me, that's a manifesto of love, and it's a manifesto of justice as well. So it's to try and get churches to recognize that they need to be, on standing up for what is right, what is just, and standing against what isn't.
So, how does Black History Month fit into this justice idea? Is it like a corrective to the way that we understand history, or is this about a time to campaign for more rights? Or
Black History Month is a celebration. You celebrate Black History Month. It's an opportunity to, as I've said before, celebrate the contributions of individuals who have often been written out of history or ignored, particularly our history. And, you for instance, I've mentioned the church, but, you think of the contributions of the Windrush generation to the National Health Service, to the transport system, but also you think of politics, you think of music, you think of history, you think of education, and it's a massive contribution. But what tends to happen often is that those contributions are overlooked or ignored. So, for instance, I myself have friends and relatives who, prior to 1948, helped fight alongside the Allies during the Second World War, and even some in the First World War. But often that contribution has been overlooked; it's been ignored. And I think it's important to recognise that individuals from the Caribbean, from Africa, often sort of left those areas of the world and came to Britain because they wanted to fight alongside, and it was part of the empire, particularly in terms of the Caribbean and certain bits of Africa, wanted to fight alongside those in the mother country, as they called it, against tyranny and against authoritarianism. And sometimes they actually paid their own passage, they paid their own fares to do that. But, you look at the average war film, with someone like John Mills or Dirk Bogarde, the films that were made even in the 40s and the early 50s, you rarely see a black face, and it's as if those contributions, as if we weren't there. And I think it's important to recognize that black and brown people in particular did fight alongside British service people during the First World War and also the Second World War. So it's not a case of our contribution started in 1948. No, it started earlier than that. And then if you do your history, you recognise that black people have been in Britain since in significant numbers since the 1600s. During Tudor times, there were a number of black people. In fact, you had an individual who played in Henry VIII's court. Henry VIII's court or Elizabeth I's court. He was called John Black, interestingly enough, and he was he played a trumpet. But you study Georgian history, during the 18th century, and there was a significant black presence in Britain at the time, and some of it was connected to Britain's connection to the transatlantic slave trade. So some individuals had actually fled slavery and were living in this country and were fighting alongside individuals like William Wilberforce, Thomas Clarkson, John Newton, and the Clapham sect to try and effect freedom for their fellow brothers and sisters who were enslaved in parts of the Caribbean as well as North America. So it's a rich history. It's a long history. It's a history that is British history. And you know what's amazing is the fact that often people call it Black history, but it's British history. So I've told you about the Second World War. I've told you about the First World War. That's British history. I've told you about the abolition movement, Thomas Clarkson, William Wilberforce, John Newton. They're British figures. That happened in Britain. The abolition movement was in Britain. So we're talking about British history. Black people engaged and involved with British history. That's everyone's history. It just so happens that for far too often, those individuals were written out of history. They were ignored. And what I find amazing is, and I've been interested in this topic for years, but when you first sort of spoke about these figures, these individuals, people assumed you were making it up. People thought, well, you're just looking for, you're just trying to be cute. You're just looking to sort of say, well, we were around and, figures that I've mentioned, like Equiano, Mary Prince, gosh, I forgot the woman's name now. The nurse, who alongside Florence Nightingale, and people just assumed, these individuals, you're just making them up. They didn't exist, but it's all there. It's sometimes it's hidden in plain sight. You just have to do the work. But again, I think it's about how we teach history in this country. Where there certain individuals get venerated and certain individuals just get sort of written out of history, just get totally ignored. And in the case of plenty of Black men and women, they were just generally ignored. And I think it's an opportunity. Black History Month is an opportunity to write back into history those individuals who have been written out for whatever reason.
Yeah. I think it's really important. I worked before I worked for Roots, I did some working with an independent publisher, and I worked with an author called Ricky Strachan who wrote a book called African Kings. It's a picture book, and it was because he wanted to allow his children to see faces that look like theirs in their history books. Because his daughter would be reading the Tudor history, and it's all white kings, and she's like, where are people who look like me? And I do think it is getting a little bit better, but I think our curriculum still has a preference towards what is traditionally history and those traditional sources. And as you say, that there seems to be worry that we are rewriting history when, as you say, we're not rewriting, we're just highlighting that all of this is going on alongside it.
I think we're just telling the whole story. We're telling the complete story. So it's not, as you say, people being cute or sort of a politically correct version of history. What we're seeking to do is to tell the whole story. What tends to happen is we tell an aspect of a story, and sometimes it's deliberate, and sometimes it's almost accidental. I mean, what we tend to do with history, we just try and sort of explain things in a very simplistic way so people can understand it, and often that simplistic way writes certain individuals out, and we get a particular narrative. That narrative becomes the standard narrative, and anything else is almost deemed to be deviant. And like I said, often when people sort of spoke about Black individuals, Black figures, particularly within a British context, people would think, he's making that up. You're just being, you're trying to be either problematic or argumentative, or you're just talking up somebody whose role was inconsequential, and that's not the case.
I think it was interesting. We had Mark Sturge with us at one of our Roots writing conferences, and he is a Black theologian. And I remember him reflecting on the Bible passages with us. And he pointed out that in every passage there was a foreigner who had a key role. And I remember reflecting in that conference that as I read the passages, I naturally sort of associated myself with the main characters, not with the foreigners. And he was feeling like he had grown up as a minority, and he noticed the minority in all the stories. And it was this realization, which later I was like kind of horrified with myself that here I was, probably a Gentile woman who would have been a minority and an outcast in all of these stories, but I associated myself with the main character because of my whiteness. And to have somebody reflect back to me that that's not how everybody reads the story, again, that the history, and as you say, the default narrative is that this is the majority. And even as the church, we associate ourselves with the Jews, or we associate ourselves with Jesus, when in fact he was a person of color. He would have been brown skinned growing up in the Middle East. He's not white. And I know that's not a new revelation, but again, I think we have to keep bringing this back into focus, because our default narrative is the history or the theology or even the way of understanding scripture that we've always had. So I'm very keen for us to engage with Black History Month, or just engage with these topics, even if it is more than 1 month a year. But how, as a say white church leader, how do we engage well with Black History Month and it not feel token? I think some of us back in 2020, when things were kicking off, Black Lives Matters, there were protests, it felt like it was urgent to respond to this. And I think we waded in with good intentions, and often those conversations were full of pain and difficulty. And we thought, I know this is important. We have to talk about race. It's a construct. It's not, it's not biologically anything there, but it's still shaping how our society lives. But how do we do this well and not cause more pain and more trauma and end up being more racist, as it were? How does a white person or church leader use that role to raise awareness and to talk about this without making it worse? That's my big question.
Well, I think, you asked some very trenchant questions there. I think one of the great things about Black History Month is that it's a celebration. So what you're doing is celebrating the contributions that generally I would say Black British people have made to this country. And that's, that's something that we can all do. And it's, I think it's refreshing and it's educational, and it can be inspiring to find out something you didn't know about a significant Black man or woman and what they've, the contributions that they've made to this country. And there's always something that we don't know. We naturally assume we know a lot, but there's always something that we can find out. And I think Black History Month it can take us on that specific journey. And it shouldn't be controversial. The argument is, why is it that we didn't know this? You might come across a fact or a figure or a statistic or a bit of information, a nugget of information that you didn't know about. And you might ask yourself, well, why didn't I know about that? It might be, X amount of Black individuals fought during the Second World War, or, there was an African corps, that sort of fought alongside individuals in Egypt, so you might be thinking to yourself, well, why didn't I know that? And some of that might be connected to the fact that, it's how we teach history. And for some people, that's not significant. And you mentioned the kind of a standard narrative and some of the standard narrative is that, it was plucky Brits with the help of a few Americans who fought against these nasty Nazis. And that's, again, it's a shorthand way of actually telling the history. But I think, Black History Month is a celebration. And again, Windrush Day is also a celebration. There are more challenging sort of special Sundays or special events like Racial Justice Sunday. I think that's more challenging. But I think it's about entry points. It's about having entry points, access points, which enable individuals to find out more about this history. And in finding out more, in terms of their knowledge base, they seek to improve that. And my hope is that what people find out in October, they continue to learn or study in November and December. And the challenge is to ensure that Black History Month isn't a tick box exercise. It isn't sort of tokenistic, whereby you sort of say, okay, well, we found out that in October, let's just leave it there, until next year. I think, using that analogy of the journey, it's an opportunity for us to find out more about the histories of individuals of African heritage, whether you're talking about people from what people would call continental Africa, or the diaspora, whether you're talking about the Caribbean or elsewhere, but individuals who actually share the same spaces as we do in the United Kingdom, and Ireland as well. But it's about that sort of context. You mentioned George Floyd and 2020, and I think what happened there is we generally didn't talk about race, or we preferred not to talk about race, and then this massive, almost cataclysmic event happened, and for many in the church and society, it was a kairos moment. It was, to quote Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King, it required the fierce urgency of now in terms of how we responded to it. And I think that many of us didn't have the tools or the resources to engage in these issues properly in ways that wouldn't leave us open to being accused of being simplistic, or naive, or being overbearing. And I think what some people felt, they felt they had to do something, but they didn't want to do the wrong thing and get accused of being racist, or problematizing the situation. So some people didn't do anything, but it did require a response. And I think what we saw, particularly in 2020, and it was an American scenario, so let's not forget that it happened in the United States, but clearly it resonated with many folk on these shores, because it spoke about their experiences, and often and more often than not, particularly from a church perspective, these things happen, but we don't talk about it. We're very polite in church. We prefer to sort of talk around issues, or better still, not talk about them at all. I've known people who had literally had been sort of holding all of this stuff back. And I think, when I sort of started to engage with people after in the aftermath of the, the George Floyd killing, particularly African Caribbean people or Black British people, it was, I call it breaking the silence, where people had an opportunity to talk about some of the stuff that they'd seen and experienced both in church and society, and they hadn't spoken about. They'd held it in, and giving people an opportunity to talk about that was cathartic. It gave them an opportunity to get stuff off their chest. And I think many white Christians, in hearing their Black brothers and sisters talk in such a very passionate way, were sort of surprised. Some were surprised and some were shocked.
Yeah.
Some were thinking, well, where did that come from? I thought everything was fine. But I one of the things that I developed was a series of steps, and towards what I would call racial justice. And the first step really is acknowledging that there is a problem, and then issues of breaking the silence, but also issues to do with lament and repentance. And then there's another step around education, and connected to education is Black History Month, Racial Justice Sunday, Windrush Sunday, when we get to hear more about the stories of the individuals who are Black, particularly Black folk, who share, are a part of our congregations. What are their stories? How is it that they happen to be in this country? Why are they here? And often, and more often than not, we don't get to hear those particular stories. And then obviously there are issues around training, in terms particularly leadership. And I always say that if churches took racial justice as seriously as they have to take safeguarding, I think we would see a massive change in our churches in terms of how they respond to justice, but particularly racial justice. It wouldn't be deemed the kind of a hobby horse of a particular individual or a few interested parties, but as I think it would be everyone's business. It would be something that you couldn't opt out of. It would be, everyone would have to engage with it. It's it's everyone's business and it's unfinished business. That to me is how it should be. But Black History Month is one of the entry points. It's one of the access points. And as I said, it's about celebrating the contributions of individuals whose efforts have often gone, unsung. They're the unsung heroes. They're the individuals who, don't appear often in the history books. And this I sort of segue slightly away from Black History Month and look at this conversation around reparations for, I've mentioned African chattel enslavement, the transatlantic slave trade. And, it's a conversation that a lot of churches are having now. But people have been talking about this for 30, 40 years. I've got a book at the moment that I've been asked to review. It's written by an eminent professor at Oxford University, a professor in ethics. And he himself, in his introduction, has said he's been teaching this subject for 35 years. And he, for whatever reason, never thought about writing a book on reparations. He did now because clearly it's part of a zeitgeist. It's an idea whose time has come. So he's turning his attention to it. But, why didn't he do so 30 odd years ago, 35 years ago? It's not a new subject. You're talking about a topic, enslavement, which sort of ended in Britain in 1834. So you're talking about, many years. Why is he turning his attention to it now? Which is, fascinating, but it's a bit like Black History Month. What's interesting in terms of Black History Month was there was a white British writer. I've got his book, Staying Power, Pete Fryer, who wrote a book on Black history in, I think it was like 1980, in the 1980s. And then James Walvin wrote another book. And I remember at the time when Pete Fryer's book came out, because he was quite left-wing, people just thought he was just making it up. All this Black history, Black British history. People just said it's just propaganda. And then, James and another white academic called James Walvin has written something. And then subsequently you had Black British people writing the history. And it's to the point now where people recognize, this did happen. But it takes time. It takes, if you're talking about 1987 to today.
Churches. Well, I think in churches, this can feel political.
Yeah.
So there will be people who will resist this. And maybe you could help us. Like, how do we speak constructively with someone in your church who objects or complains about the fact that we're doing Black History Month in church? They'll be like, this isn't in the Bible. This is not a church festival. Is this a leftist or woke agenda? And of course, we're trying to engage with history, examine our own hearts, allow God to challenge us and teach us. But they'll be like, well, this isn't about the Bible. This is history. Like, so why is this happening in church? Or why are you stirring this up? Why are you pushing your political agenda here? So what would you say if somebody has to engage with that kind of critique?
Well, my starting point is we're talking about church. And I would say, well, what has been the contribution of Black British Christians to the church? So that's where I would start. And I would say it's been massive. And that needs to be celebrated. And that is a movement of God. So had it not been for these Black Christians with not Black Christian faith, I think the church would be in a very perilous situation. I think a former a bishop in the Church of England said that, had it not been for the contribution of Black Christians. So that is a fact. And I think that needs to be celebrated. And we need to thank God for that, because I think, God has been at work in that, so that's a movement of God. And I don't think Christians should have a problem in celebrating a movement of God. If God is in something, then, I think we should celebrate it. If we don't celebrate it, then I think there's something wrong with us. So that's my starting point from all of it. Then the other thing I think we should do is we should, as brothers and sisters in Christ, we should want to know more about those individuals with whom we share our churches, with whom we share our pews or benches or chairs or whatever. Because, I just think that's fellowship, that's friendship. if we call one another brethren, then that's what I think we should know. So we would want to know more about their stories, know more about their histories.
Yeah.
And again, particularly from an African Caribbean perspective, many of the individuals in the Caribbean first encountered Christ, and this is quite a contested history, via British missionaries. So again, what were the missionaries doing? Traveling to parts of Africa, traveling to parts of the Caribbean to share the gospel. And why did they do it? Well, clearly, to a degree they were successful because obviously these individuals were converted. But, it'd be interesting to know more about their modus operandi. Again, like I say, it's a contested history, but it's a part of our history, and again, these individuals are inspired by the Great Commission. Matthew 28 verses 20. So again, it's about knowing that that's in the Bible. These individuals who were missionaries sort of went out often in response to the Great Commission. I mean, other things that motivated them as well. But it's about knowing that history. And to me, it's the more you know, then the less, ignorant you are, more informed you are. Chances are you're more liable to say the right thing as opposed to saying the wrong thing. And to me, that's always a good thing. It's that sort of doesn't directly address race, but it's there. It's sort of often hidden in plain sight. And I mentioned, that the work that I do as part of the church's refugee network. And again, there's so much in scripture that talks about the foreigner, the alien, offering them hospitality, offering them sanctuary, showing them God's love. And again, God clearly seems to be standing on the side of, what some would call the oppressed, but definitely on the side of, the widow, the orphan, the alien and the stranger. So again, it's that's part of a similar conversation, and those individuals who find their way on these shores, finding more about their history, more about their stories.
I wonder if you were talking about the contribution of Black Christians in the UK to the church, and I know that some of the fastest growing churches in the UK are Black majority, often Nigerian churches in London. They're huge, but there is still this sense that perhaps some of the church is segregated, although not officially, but sort of culturally or just in our worshipping practices, we don't worship together as much as we could, and so church on a Sunday morning can still feel quite separate. White churches over here, Black churches over there, and a few sprinkling in between, as it were. But it doesn't feel as connected as possible. Is there something that we can do during Black History Month to engage with other churches in our community that might be quite different to us? How could we reach out, connect, build those relationships? Have you seen that work in a way of connecting?
That's a really, really good question. I mean, obviously, if one sorts of, again, you look at the history, and it's important to know the history. You think of the Windrush generation, and often when they, particularly those folk from the Caribbean, when they arrived on these shores and tried to attend some of the historic denominations, whether you're talking about the Church of England, the Methodists, what was or what is now the United Reformed Church, but probably congregational churches, as well as Baptist churches, they weren't often given a warm welcome, and that's important. It's important to recognise that.
Yeah.
And some individuals did go off and establish their churches. That's not the whole story, because the truth of the matter is, if you were a Pentecostal in the Caribbean, then most likely you'd want to be a Pentecostal in Britain. So individuals who went off and established their own churches here probably wanted to do that anyway.
Yeah.
But what we do know is that when they first arrived, before they could establish their churches, they didn't receive a warm welcome from the white British Christian community. And we need to recognise that. And some people, and there's still a lot of hurt with regard to that. I remember an aunt of mine who sadly now deceased, but she came to Britain as a Baptist, worshipped, card-carrying Baptist, went to church twice in this country, and then got told not welcome here and didn't go back. So she was here for 12 years. When she went back to the Caribbean, went back to Jamaica, she joined a congregational church, used to sing in a choir and used to do all kinds of stuff. So her memories of the church in Britain were quite negative. For her, it was all about racism. And that's a sad indictment, really, on the church in this country. I think it's important to recognise, though, that not everybody who, some people went to, the Methodist Church, of the Church of England, of the Baptist Church, didn't receive a warm welcome, but decided to stay. They just sort of said, well, you know what, I'm not going to go. I know that God has called me here, and I'm going to be resolute, and I'm going to stand up, and stand against the prejudice. And, there's still a good number of, no, a massive number. You go to a lot of the Church of England churches in London, and there's a good number. In fact, some of them are black majority churches, and it goes for Methodist churches as well. So, it's a complex picture.
Yeah.
What you have are denominations, like, Church of England, my church is quite diverse.
Yeah.
It's got a good number of black people, good number of white people, good number of people of South Asian heritage as well. And it's quite diverse. You have African churches, as you point out, some Nigerian, some Ghanaian, some Sierra Leonean, that are very monocultural, very homogeneous. And you have new kind of sort of evangelical churches, churches that come out of the house church movement, that are very white. And I suppose it's about opportunities of encounter. What I used to work for the Evangelical Alliance, and I remember at the time I used to go do the Bible weeks. I would go to Spring Harvest and Easter People, and what always surprised me was, seeing, and it was, largely kind of white Christians worshipping there, was how they worshipped was very similar to how Black Pentecostals worship, hardly any difference. So you kind of then think to yourself, well, it's not as if somebody, from Africa, Nigeria, if they came here and saw the sort of a very expressive way in which people worship, hands in the air and speaking in tongues or praying in tongues, that kind of a sort of experience, experiential sort of Christianity, they wouldn't feel at home with any of that, because they would, but there was something stopping them from attending events like that. And it's about trying to create opportunities for encounter, for meeting, for sharing. And I know in the past, people have sort of tried to kind of get churches to, one church visits another church. I mean, you've got to, if that's going to happen, it can't be tokenistic.
Yeah.
It's got to be sincere, it's got to be genuine, and people have tried that. And in the same way that people try, to have international evenings, and again, sometimes it can be a little trite, it can be a little kind of cliched and insincere. I think what we really want to have opportunities where people meet, because you think of, the picture of what heaven is like in Revelation. And it's people of every tribe and every nation, and the church should be a house for all nations. So that's how we want it to be. But it's got to be genuine, it's got to be sincere. It's got to be, got to be places where if, you are, you're black or you're brown, you go there, you feel as if you're welcomed, you belong there. The God-given gifts that you've got are being used wisely to build up, Christ's kingdom. That's what you feel. Sometimes, people don't feel as if that's the case. And, I know of situations, particularly in my work, where, you've got individuals who go to, Church of England churches or Methodist churches, and they've been going for years, and just come in, sit at the back, sing a few hymns for the collection, and then leave. Nobody really talks to them. Nobody knows that much about them. And what's weird is that their equivalent in a Pentecostal church is either leading the church or in a significant role within the church. So there's something about those churches that enables people to use or untethers their God-given talents to build up the church and to build further Christ's kingdom. And there's something within the denominations, whether you're talking about the historic ones or the new former house churches, that holds people back.
Yeah.
That doesn't enable them to use their talents. And to me, it's a tragedy, because
Yeah.
it's not as if the church is in rude health. Often you're reading these reports about the church is in terminal decline.
Yeah.
Certain denominations will cease to exist in 20 years' time. And it's never really a positive story. But when one looks at, say, the black church and even the Asian church, you think of a church at the moment with folk coming in from Hong Kong, what you suppose you could call them Chinese churches, and how they're growing for various socio political reasons. And we could do with that. It's like
Yeah.
it's like sort of trying to do something with one hand tied behind your back. Imagine how much more you could do with the other hand. And somebody said, a bird with one wing, it can't really saw. And one bit of a scissor is useless, really. So to me, it makes sense to actually affirm those individuals of diverse backgrounds, affirm the gifts that they've got, and really kind of use them to build up the church and further God's kingdom.
Yeah, and I think some of that is about profile. So, like, for me, and when it came to leading church, for the first time I saw a woman church leader, that was a bit of a like, this has broken a glass ceiling for me, just in terms of my concept of this could happen. And I think if your church doesn't have any black or brown people on your leadership team, or getting up to lead prayers, or preaching regularly, if we never talk about black theologians, it sets the ceiling in an unspoken way that this is not a role that we expect. And so you think, well, I need to go somewhere else. Like, there are churches where there are black apostles, black bishops, black preachers, all black preachers, and why is that not here? And so some of it you can say, well, it matters that on your preaching rota that you have diverse faces, because it allows other people in, and it helps us hear other voices. I think it's really, really critical.
It is. It's affirming, isn't it? And particularly if your congregation is quite diverse. I always say, if your congregation is diverse, yet your leadership team isn't, then you've got a problem. You haven't just got an optics problem, but you've got a real problem in terms of how your church is run and the decisions that you make. So I'm not for just throwing people in there for argument's sake. I want to ensure that the people who get up to
not
preach,
to tick a box. It's not that.
Are good people, because at the end of the day, they're sharing the word of God, and you got to make sure that the people who are doing that are bona fide. But I know plenty of folk who are, but don't get the opportunity to do so. Conversely, I know individuals who who are serving ministers now and don't even believe. You ask them what they believe, and they struggle. I know one minister doesn't even believe in prayer. I don't know how that person can be in a pulpit preaching and they don't believe in prayer. But that's another story. It's a bigger story. But just to say, if some people feel as if that the they've got so much to offer, but they're not being given an opportunity to use their God-given gifts, then they will vote with their feet. They will go elsewhere, particularly if they can see other denominations and churches that are affirming individuals like themselves. And here's the thing, I mean, those churches that we've mentioned are growing churches, so it's not as if you do this sort of thing and your church is dying, this kind of so-called political correctness stuff. it might be good, but but the church is falling apart. People are not attending. That's not the case. The churches that you see that are preaching the gospel, and the individuals who are then going into those churches, black and brown, churches are growing. So it's telling you that something is something that's taking place is right. The spirit is there. I'm not naive as to suggest that growth is always the indicator that you're doing something right, because that's not the case, and I think history has told us that that's not the case. But I think it can be taken as a sign that something is going well within the church, or the church is doing the right thing in that instance. But going back to what I said, if people see that there's not a place for them, or they just feel as if they're being, just taken for granted, and they're nothing more than money in a collection plate, or they may just sort of, when it comes to taking the photograph, or the church website, they're just dragged in there just to add a bit of colour to proceedings. I think most people are not happy with that. They just think that's a little hypocritical, to be honest.
Yeah. So assuming that people have been listening to this, they think, I actually want to do something, I want to positively engage with Black History Month. Can you point us towards some tools, some resources that would help? Obviously, if you've got people, Black leaders in your church, they could obviously guide and direct, but it doesn't always have to be those people. If you haven't got Black leaders or Black people who want to contribute, I'm sure there are resources that would enable a white leader to help a congregation engage with this topic. So can you point us to some stuff that would help us?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, on the CTBI website, which is www.ctbi.org.uk, we always have a list of resources and information on Black History Month that just gives you an idea in terms of what it is, what it's about, how you can engage with it. And it's we always try and ensure that there are resources that churches can use. I mean, what's interesting is there's nothing that I'm aware of that specifically says Black History Month for Christians, but there are resources out there that for adults and for children that talk about famous Black figures. In there, you can read about the church and the church's contribution. I think that's one of the great things that we've seen over the last 10 to 15 years, are the numbers of Black Christians who are embracing Black History Month. And they're saying that it's not just about political figures, it's not just about sports individuals, it's not just about actors or whatever. We need to hear about the church as well. The church dimension needs to be a part of that. And it's important, just to sort of segue away slightly. There was an exhibition at the British Library, finished yesterday, as in bank holiday, Monday, the 26th of August, that was looking at the contribution of Black music to Britain over the last 200 years. Fascinating, whether you're talking about classical music, whether you're talking about jazz, whether you're talking about opera, whether you're talking about rock or reggae or ska or funk. What was missing was gospel music. The contribution of Black British gospel music to the climate. So you had some stuff about the Fisk singers. So it was generally African Americans who came to Britain and did tours and sang gospel music. But what they didn't have was something that looked at the contribution that gospel music has made to popular music since 1948, since the Windrush. It was a massive oversight. I'm sure if church folk went to that exhibition, so you're talking about the British Library here, really immersive exhibition, something where you could spend 2-3 hours there and still not see the whole of it. But the contribution of gospel music was missing from that. And you kind of think how influential gospel music has been, particularly on popular music. Whether you're talking about the people who play gospel music or the singers, most pop artists, whether you're talking about Adele or Robbie Williams or Ed Sheeran, their backing singers are generally people who come from gospel music backgrounds.
Yeah.
That's a fact. and you think of someone like Stormzy, and he said how he's influenced by gospel music. Yet that was missing. I think what we want to ensure, particularly from a Christian perspective, is the fact that when one looks at Black history, the Christian contribution is there. That story is told. That contribution is included, and I think that's important. But so the resources that I mentioned, they're on our website. And I think the other thing to mention is that what's interesting is often, for instance, I don't know if you're familiar with a man called Dr. Harold Moody, fascinating guy, came from Jamaica. He was a doctor. He qualified at King's in London. He practiced, he had a practice in Peckham. In the 1930s, he would set up an organization called the League of Coloured, I think it's Coloured Gentlemen, but anyway, it was an organization that fought for the rights of Black people in Britain in the 1940s and 50s. He was massive. But what's interesting about Moody is he was also a congregational minister. But when people talk about Moody, they don't mention that. So there's a blue plaque to Harold Moody in Southwark, and he mentions how he's a physician, a general practitioner, an activist, a campaigner, civil rights campaigner. What he doesn't mention is that he was a Christian. So
and a church leader at that,
and the church, yes, and so one of the things that I'm keen to do is to ensure that that history is told, and the pioneers who have actually done something from a church perspective, that so when people talk about Moody, they say, yeah, but you can't forget that it was his faith that inspired him to do all of this. I think it's important that Christians, black and white, ensure that when one looks at these figures, the fact that they're a Christian isn't just or by the way he was a Christian, or even in some instances that's not even mentioned, because like I said, on Harold Moody's blue plaque, that's not mentioned. I think that should be one of the first things that gets mentioned. But yeah, there are resources. We have resources in terms of CGBI. The Baptist Union have produced resources that look at called Visions in Black. But anyway, it's a resource that can be used throughout the year. We've got a link to that resource on the CGBI website. But like I said, it's we live in an information age. So, there's no shortage of resources. Some are good, some are not so good, but I think the vast majority are excellent. That look at this history. There's a lot out there for young people in particular, whether you're talking about sort of, primary school children or secondary school children, some written by some excellent historians like David Olusoga. You've got a magazine like Keep the Faith, which is edited by Marcia Dixon, a good friend of mine, and they always have a Black History Month special. And again, that's just focused on the contribution. It sort of lionizes and champions the Black British faith, and for Black History Month, it sort of focuses on the contributions that Black people have made to British history, particularly the church and the Christian faith in this country. And that's a really excellent resource as well, and available as a online and in hard copy. So there's no shortage of material out there. So, for instance, you look at the Windrush generation, the vast majority of the people who came in the 1940s and the 1950s, they came from the Caribbean. They were Christians. I would say between 90 to 95% of them were Christians.
Wow.
One of the things they always carried with them was a Bible. And it's funny, my wife had an exhibition in Southwark last year, and virtually everyone in their suitcase, used to call them a grip. In their grip, they had a Bible, they had a hymnal, and maybe a tambourine.
Wow.
If you were traveling, they gave you a Bible. They said, you've got to go with your Bible. Somebody always gave you a Bible. Even if you didn't have one, you were given a Bible. But you carried your Bible with you. You had your hymnal in there as well. And, if you're Pentecostal, you would go with your tambourine. But that's how you traveled, because you were a Christian. That's what you did. And the first thing you did when you came here, you found that you looked for an accommodation, somewhere to stay, somewhere to live, a job, that enabled you to live, and a church that sort of enabled you to live spiritually.
I love that. I love that the church can be the epicenter of equipping these people to bring change, equipping them to live holy lives. And, you know, as you say, like these world changers that we're hearing the story of, it was embedded in this church, and the leadership that they developed there, the networks and the community that they developed there, that would empower them to go on and bring change. And I'm hoping that that's what our churches are now, that we are places that we empower, we create leadership, we are worshipping communities, that we teach people to sing so they can impact gospel music. We teach people to lead so they can impact society. We teach people to pray so that things change. And I think it's also got to be the place where we tell these stories so that we know. And, you know, a lot of us have finished school a very long time ago. We're not studying history unless we watch a documentary on television. But in church, that can be a place where we can, again, pick up some of this story and come back to it and be challenged to look again, or hear the stories of the people right around us, the current stories. It doesn't have to be history from long ago. It can be history that's current and unfolding around us.
We're always making history, aren't we? That's the thing about history. And I think, you know, just sort of going back to what you just alluded to there, you think of particularly the black church in this country. And for many people, it's the success story of a black community. You know, some would argue that it's, you know, the black church is the most consistent, the most coherent representation of a black community or black communities in Britain. And, you know, what you have in Britain, if one is talking to, if you want to talk to black, you know, a large subset of black people, you go into a church. It's no coincidence that, you know, around election time, whether you're talking about local elections or general elections, you know, if a politician wants to engage with a large number of black people, he will go to a church, or she will go to a church, a black church. And black church leaders are de facto community leaders, you know, rightly or wrongly, you know, that is the case. And, you know, you look at a denomination like, say, like the New Testament Church of God, or the Church of God of Prophecy, or the New Testament Assembly. I know their history particularly well. You know, it started in 1961 when two individuals from Jamaica arrived here, and they would worship in a front room in Balham. And within about 30 years, they had churches up and down the country, and then churches internationally. And you kind of think, well, you know, if that was a business, you know, I'm not saying it is, but if you sort of equated that to a business like a supermarket, you know, those individuals would be honored, they would be revered, everyone would know their names, they would have OBE or Sir or Lord or something after their names. But, you know, and you think of the spiritual impact that these individuals have had, because often, you know, the as I've said, you know, the pastor or the bishop would be a de facto community leader. If somebody wanted an important letter written for them, they would go to the pastor. If somebody wanted, you know, a young boy was in trouble, they would go to the pastor, and the pastor would intervene with, you know, engage with the family and then the authorities on that young person's behalf. If you wanted some advice, some guidance, you would always go to the pastor, whether you're talking about emotional or spiritual or whatever. They had that type of role. So you think of how many lives were saved, how many lives are transformed by the contribution of these individuals, and it's massive. And to me, that needs to be you know, acknowledged, and that needs to be celebrated. You know, alongside, you know, the contributions of others as well. But you know what has tended to happen is, you know, initially when people mark Black History Month, the church just wasn't included, you know, and I think it was important for black Christians to ensure that, you know, that aspect of Black History Month was told. And I think it's important that, you know, as Christians per se, we ensure that contribution it continues to be told, because it's a positive story. You know, it's not a story of decline. It's not a story of things withering, you know, in terms of, you know, atrophying. And it's a story of growth. It's you know, something that we can all celebrate and get behind, because it's a movement of God. You know, God is at work, and he's at the center of it. And, you know, if he's at the center of something, then we should all get behind it and celebrate it.
It's amazing. Yeah, thank you for telling us these stories and raising awareness, because I think it is important, and people can get in their own lane and see what they see because it's what they bump into. And when you see the breadth of what God is doing, is really inspiring.
Yeah.
And it just makes me want to go and find out more. And I hope people will do that. I hope they'll go to the CTPI website. I hope they will engage with Black History Month and those in their community. Thank you, Richard, for your wisdom.
No problem.
And championing this in the UK. It's been brilliant.
Thank you.
No, I really appreciate it.
Excellent.
Roots publish a huge range of resources for churches. To explore all our weekly, topical and seasonal content, as well as helpful articles, images and illustrations, you can take out a free 1-month digital trial at rootsforchurches.com. Whether you follow the Revised Common Lectionary Bible readings each week, Common Worship, or perhaps your church has your own preaching plan going through a book or topic, you can find resources for pretty much any Bible reading. Just search our website by Bible passage to find intergenerational services, Bible notes, sermon ideas, toddler, children and youth sessions, and so much more. We know you're committed to your church community changing lives, and you've got a lot on your plate. So whether you need ideas to inspire or a structure to follow, we've got you covered. Roots for Churches, resources you can trust. If you've been helped or inspired by this podcast, please subscribe so you don't miss any future episodes. And we'd love it if you could share it with your friends and leave us a comment or review. Together we can grow. Thanks.